In the summer of 1988, a German marine biology student named Christian Sommer was on the Italian Riviera, in a small coastal town called Rapallo, collecting tiny hydrozoans for a completely unrelated research project. He kept them in petri dishes, checking on them periodically, the way any grad student manages a batch of lab organisms. They aren't really the main focus of anyone's attention. And at some point, checking on one particular species, he noticed something that didn't make sense. Instead of dying, the way jellyfish in these situations are simply supposed to do, one had done something else entirely. It hadn't died. It had gone backwards. Sommer didn't immediately grasp what he was looking at, and honestly, it took the better part of a decade for anyone to. It wasn't until 1996 that a formal paper, authored by Stefano Piraino and Ferdinando Boero, along with two collaborators, laid out exactly what was happening, under the title Reversing the Life Cycle, describing an animal that was, at the time, classified as Turritopsis nutricula. Subsequent taxonomic work has since sorted out that the specific species actually capable of this trick is what we now call Turritopsis dohrnii, a small, unremarkable-looking hydrozoan jellyfish, translucent, roughly the size of a fingernail, that you would walk straight past in a tide pool without a second glance. And yet, this tiny, forgettable animal appears to have solved a problem no other known animal on Earth has ever solved. It found a loophole in its own aging process, and it's still using it. To understand how strange that actually is, you need to understand how a jellyfish's life cycle is supposed to work in the first place, because for the overwhelming majority of species in this group, it's a one-way street. A fertilized jellyfish larva settles onto a hard surface and develops into a polyp, a small, stationary, plant-like stage anchored to a rock or a shell, more closely resembling a tiny sea anemone than anything you'd call a jellyfish. From that polyp, through budding, tiny medusae eventually release and swim off, growing into the free-floating, pulsing, tentacled adult form most people actually picture when they hear the word jellyfish. That's the whole journey. Polyp to medusa, one direction, and once an individual reaches full adulthood, its story from there runs the same way every other animal's does. It ages, eventually, through injury, stress, or simple old age, it dies. And that's the end of that individual, permanently. Turritopsis dohrnii runs the exact same life cycle, right up until the point where, for almost every other jellyfish on the planet, the story would end. When an adult medusa of this species is significantly damaged, starved, or simply pushed past the physical stress it can handle, it doesn't die. Instead, it does something that sounds more like undoing a save file than anything you'd expect from a biological organism. The bell collapses in on itself. The tentacles get reabsorbed back into the body. The animal loses its ability to swim entirely, sinks, and settles onto the seafloor as a small, shapeless blob, structurally almost nothing like the animal it was hours earlier. And then, over the following 24 to 36 hours, instead of finishing the process of dying, that blob reorganizes itself back into a polyp, the exact developmental stage it started from as a genetic infant. From there, the polyp can mature and eventually bud off new medusae all over again, restarting a life cycle that, for every other jellyfish species on record, only ever runs in one direction. The biological name for what's actually happening at the cellular level is transdifferentiation, and it's worth sitting with what that word is actually describing, because it's more radical than simply healing or regenerating a wound. In most animals capable of impressive regeneration, a starfish regrowing an arm, a salamander regrowing a limb, specialized stem cells or nearby tissue get recruited to rebuild a missing part, while everything else about the organism stays exactly as differentiated, as specialized, as it already was. What Turritopsis dohrnii does goes a meaningful step further. Existing, already fully specialized adult cells from an adult medusa's tissue actually convert directly into different, earlier cell types entirely, effectively reprogramming themselves backward along their own developmental path, rebuilding the polyp stage from cells that had already committed to being something else. It's less like a lizard regrowing a tail and considerably more like taking a fully built house, dissolving it back down into raw lumber and nails on the spot, and reassembling those exact same materials into the foundation of an entirely new build. Before this goes any further, it's worth being precise about what immortal actually means here, because the popular label oversells this animal in one very specific way and undersells it in another. This is not an invincible animal. A Turritopsis dohrnii swallowed by a fish, crushed against a rock, or simply killed outright by some other predator or hazard is just as dead as any other jellyfish on the reef, immediately and permanently. What this species appears to have found isn't an escape from death in general. It's an escape from one very specific cause of death, the ordinary process of aging and senescence that eventually catches up with essentially every other complex animal on the planet, humans very much included. Left alone, undamaged, unstressed, and unbothered by predators, a Turritopsis dohrnii may, in principle, never simply run out of biological road the way the rest of us do. That's a genuinely different and arguably more interesting claim than blanket invincibility, and it's exactly the specific claim that's turned this unremarkable little jellyfish into one of the most closely studied animals in the entire field of aging research. Because if a real animal has actually found a way to bypass senescence, even under lab conditions, even only when triggered by a specific kind of stress, the obvious next question for anyone studying human aging is simple. How? And in 2022, a research team finally had the tools to start answering that question properly, publishing the first complete whole genome comparison between Turritopsis dohrnii and its closest known relative, a nearly identical species called Turritopsis rubra that looks almost the same, lives in similar waters, and, critically, cannot do this trick at all. When one species can reverse its own aging, and its nearest genetic cousin simply can't, comparing their full genomes side by side becomes one of the most direct ways available to isolate exactly what's different. The 2022 study, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, found meaningful differences concentrated in genes tied to DNA replication and repair, telomere maintenance, the body's redox and oxidative stress environment, the regulation of stem cell populations, and intercellular communication. Essentially, the entire toolkit an organism would need to keep its DNA clean, its cells communicating properly, and its regenerative machinery switched on far longer than evolution usually bothers to maintain it. None of that hands researchers a simple, single immortality gene they can copy and paste. What it does is something more useful for actual science, a specific comparative map of exactly which biological systems are worth studying more closely in an animal that has, in some meaningful sense, already solved a problem the rest of the animal kingdom hasn't. There's one more twist to this story, and it's the part that turns a strange piece of jellyfish trivia into a genuinely global event, because the same trait that lets an individual Turritopsis dohrnii dodge death from starvation or injury also turns out to be an extraordinarily effective survival tool for something that trait was never evolved to handle: an ocean crossing inside a cargo ship. Large vessels take on massive volumes of seawater as ballast to stay stable, drawing it in at one port and discharging it at another, often an entire ocean away, and in the process, they accidentally transport whatever small marine life happens to be caught up in that water along with it. For most animals, weeks spent in a dark, crowded, food-poor ballast tank would simply be a death sentence. For an animal that can respond to exactly that kind of starvation and stress by reverting to a hardy, stationary polyp stage and effectively pausing its own biological clock until conditions improve, it's closer to a built-in survival strategy for exactly this scenario. As a direct result, a jellyfish first documented in a small town on the Italian Riviera has since turned up in harbors and coastal waters across Japan, both coasts of Panama, Florida, Spain, the Gulf of Mexico, and Brazil, effectively hitchhiking its way around large stretches of the planet, inside the ballast tanks of the global shipping industry. It's often described as an invasive species at this point, given how widely it's spread, though it's worth being honest that solid evidence of actual ecological damage caused by its presence remains fairly thin. What isn't in question is the spread itself. A biological trick that evolved to save one individual jellyfish from a bad afternoon has, quite by accident, made its entire species one of the most well-traveled animals in the ocean. So here's what you're actually left with once you separate the real biology from the headline. not an invincible sea monster, and not literally eternal life in the way the word immortal tends to imply. Something stranger, and honestly more useful to actual science, a small, unremarkable jellyfish that, under the right kind of stress, can dissolve its own fully developed adult body down to raw biological material, and rebuild itself from an earlier stage of its own life, indefinitely, as many times as the situation demands. A trick first spotted by accident in a grad student's Petri dish in 1988, formally confirmed 8 years later, and only really starting to be understood at the genetic level in the last few years, with direct implications for how scientists think about human aging itself. And, almost as a footnote, a trick effective enough at cheating death that it's turned this jellyfish into an accidental world traveler, riding out storms and starvation in the bottom of cargo ships, rebuilding itself from scratch somewhere in the dark mid-ocean, and turning up on the other side of the planet, none the worse for the trip. Next time, we're going backward about 270 million years, to a fossil that looks so wrong when it was first found that paleontologists spent nearly a century arguing about which part of the animal's body a spiral of teeth the size of a dinner plate was actually attached to. That one's called Helicoprion, and it's coming next. Let me know in the comments what you want cataloged after that, and subscribe to Claw Catalog if you want to be here for it.